Okay, and
Hello
welcome
again, and welcome back to the Explaining
Explaining
History podcast. And I'm
delighted to be joined today by Mark Aedy, who's written
Mixing Pop
a
and Politics.
memoir
I had to think
of
of my favourite Billy
his
Bragg lyrics
father's
there for a moment.
experiences
Mixing Pop and Politics,
in aviation,
history of
before, during, and after
music.
the Second World War. His father, Ken Aedy, who lived through
am I correct
a period of
when we talk about
extraordinary
Marxist
innovation
because this is a very
aviation.
kind of for those that aren't
biplanes to
embedded
fast
in
jets is the title of the book.
Marxist
and
thought.
that really kind of takes us on our journey to begin with.
Marxist approaches to history
Mark, it's a
are
pleasure
sort
to have you today.
Quite misunderstood.
Nick,
and
it's a pleasure to be
the
here.
idea that kind of history is the product of kind of like material.
Actually, it's Dad wrote the work,
relations,
so he deserves
kind
all
of
the credit.
that sort of
credit. All I've done is put
history is made by
pictures
the president of history is made with kind of by
flew together.
Who has the stuff and who does the work
to do his story and his narrative justice.
How sort of does that translate into our understanding of this kind of really curious phenomenon of popular music? Let's talk about your dad.
Say the 1950s.
And his life in aviation.
Well, I guess yes. I suppose it's an attempt to move away from popular culture, specifically music,
with pleasure,
as being in some sort of separate category of the aesthetic, and to try and move it into the material without that becoming I don't know, without sort of removing the appeal or the magic of music, the power of music. In fact, I mean, I suppose I think that in some ways it enhances the power and the sort of depth of music, and the importance of music.
Either to South Africa, Canada, or the US.
And a lot of what my little boy's just making an awful lot of noise in the background. Hold on a moment.
We can go into more detail about his time learning to fly.
There you go, adding a bit of kind of edgy realism to the podcast.
He came back and transitioned
a lot of
from onto heavy bombers.
What
flying
seems to transpire in the title is the idea of pop music is also the product of kind of conflict as well,
but also
and protest,
participating in the celebrated
and that kind of thing.
Operation Man, the dropping of food supplies,
I mean,
the starving
to what extent really is that the case? I mean, if we look at the history of pop music,
back to the UK after their great
our moments of kind of social and cultural struggle within pop music, sort of outliers, and we all just listening to
he elected not
melodies that make us feel better, or is it really sort of central to the history of pop
he elected
music?
to stay on in the Royal Air Force, and then
I mean, obviously there are different phases of this. You know, it's not just one sort of long, sort of samey sweep. But I mean, I would say particularly in the first sort of 30 or so years of popular music that I chart. Just to clarify, so I start kind of with rock and roll.
He was very lucky
in about from around 1953, 1954
to do something he loved.
I think that conflict is absolutely central. That some level of
very basic aircraft.
Protest music has a very specific kind of notion that it has to be kind of quite explicitly political and it's about a particular issue.
So the majority of his war service
was an awful lot of
with Bomber
has
Command.
Been essentially a protest about things like societal expectations, the way that we live, the way that we're forced to live or behave,
where is he mainly sort of deployed?
So it feels to me like the protest and the conflict is often quite subtle, and a lot of the time we miss it. I mean, I missed it because of this sort of aestheticization of culture. I just treated music as a sort of separate thing to politics, and I never thought it had much relationship to the sort of socio-political currents which produced it.
Very end of the war in
I mean, and I think the thing is that
which is one of those huge missions.
Music is obviously always made by people, and people will always be situated within society in a particular set of relations, not always of their choosing, not always
through to Berlin.
Of their kind of.
He would argue
not as of benefit to them.
That he
you're always getting
the end of the war when, broadly speaking, the air battle
there are always elements of struggle
Germany
in whatever people do
won by the Allies.
Culture.
Having said that, on that Potsdam raid,
the beginnings of popular culture. I mean, you started in the 1950s, but obviously you have to really look all the way back to the turn of the century almost to see the kind of the development of the recording artist and that kind of thing. But the reason why I think the 1950s are important is because
dropping of food supplies,
you have this explosion of mass affluence after the Second World War. I mean, obviously in Britain there's a period of austerity, but by the time you get into the era of kind of Little Richard and then Elvis and then eventually the Beatles, we're going through this period of time which is almost completely unprecedented.
Anything like the rest of his colleagues, many of whom he lost.
And you mentioned expectations, and I often think about the kind of the kitchen sink dramas of that period, things like kind of Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and which is all about working class life, and actually working class life that's getting better.
So it actually had
but
the highest
people being
casualty rate of
with
any division of any force.
All the realities
war,
of
second only
work.
to U-boats.
And with that period of mass affluence, is that the kind of one of the sort of many years ago in my instrumental factors in teaching, I spent a summer at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite complicated, obviously, as you suggest, because I think the 50s, as I say in my book, has become this sort of halcyon age, actually for left and right.
The way in which they were treated
but for conservatives,
after the end of the war,
period of sort of stability and
extraordinarily
shabby. I have to overlook an awful lot of what I'm writing about
for a number of
in my
reasons.
book,
Firstly,
not to mention,
at the end of the war,
add in the angry young
things like the bombing of Dresden and Churchill's comments was a case of
I think that
there's a lot of kind of
so basically, yeah, I mean, I quote Jeremy Gilbert saying that the
50s
was the first time when people didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming.
It's a very, very kind of
and so both
morally fraught area.
I think,
question
of and the welfare state.
And so there was some not much of a kind of a hero's welcome class, but the way in which they
gave them new options apart from just working at a dead end job, it made it seem possible for them to enter the cultural milieu that was
on these missions, even the ones that weren't injured, who have terrific post-traumatic
stress. People were going to university, so horizons and expectations were expanding.
Like to go up in a Lancaster,
but I also think that the kids sort of brought up into this sort of new world,
and many of them were
who hadn't
very
had
unwell.
that experience
physically,
of
there was
privation.
terrible tuberculosis.
Therefore, grew up with sort of new expectations instilled.
Your dad
didn't feel the same need to be sort of almost grateful.
How was he at the end of the war? Was he in a good way,
they were given?
Was he?
And so my argument is very much that
very important sort of.
You have to be careful with this. I feel like social democracy, if we're going to call it that,
command and the strategy adopted by
is the sort of condition of possibility for these various youth and cultural movements, and which on some level you can say, well, gosh, that's right, grateful, isn't it? They get all the stuff and they turn around and say, no, we want more, like Oliver.
But
on the other hand, that leaves out the fact that these things that had happened, they didn't just happen because of the largesse of the ruling class or organically. They were a result of a very long, bloody struggle on the part of the working class in the face of resistance of the ruling class. So,
and the potential
it seems to me that
women and children
demanding yet
were
more
killed
is a perfectly logical,
and I think he felt
logical consequence of that sort of longer sweep.
But his response was,
I mean, if you take the song "Working Class Hero" by John Lennon,
and with a view really
in that he sort of details. What it's like to grow up working class. I mean, there are all these sort of debates about whether he was actually a member of the petty bourgeoisie or, and that's
we were aware of the concentration camps.
By the by,
and the war needed to finish.
His Aunt Mimi, I think, was kind of
and
not
also, importantly,
so proletarian, but
I was doing my duty and responding.
He describes that sort of.
Nevertheless, I think he felt
kind of simmering anger and resentment
non-military
throughout the song.
Civilians. I think he was frustrated.
I guess that's kind of a sort of snapshot of what you're talking about in a way. That yes, he had been the beneficiary of progressive change since
and Transport Command equally didn't get a campaign medal. So he felt that he wasn't
still
alone.
Kind of.
I think he would have been thrilled by the arrival of
angry for a variety of reasons, but angry about the experience of kind of class and the experience of
would have thought that was an appropriate image
in a very
means of
class-bound society.
But look, going back to
his words about carefully chosen, you think you're so clever
disorder,
and classless and free,
book in the sense
but you're still fucking peasants, as far as I can see.
Much more sensitive,
that gets to it, doesn't it? That classless was the buzzword of the 60s.
My father,
very much,
sadly, had the first of 3 heart attacks in 1973 when he was only
still exists, and he'd been
and there have been moments
at the coalface of it, because
me and my family
just look at something quite structural, like the way that EMI treated the Beatles initially, and even late on, you watch that
had an undue impact.
Get Back documentary.
We'll never know.
EMI are still just furiously penny pinching regarding this sort of jumped up upstart proletarian art form
participate in that technological
they're kind of having to beg for for all sorts of equipment, for cameras, for keyboards,
the war is this period
etc. Like there's no budget.
Innovation,
this is the biggest group in the world,
particularly in terms of. I was reading a while back, and it's a great book if you haven't read it. Duff McKagan's autobiography. A lot of it is kind of trial and error, and because he's flying so easy another life, and he talks about by 1943. So a lot of and he talks. You have learned by basically a bunch of working class guys. By and large, was and the extent to which suddenly finished his at the end of the war, had been happening long before. Kind of record company experienced. Were looking to mine this. Essentially, the record company guys weren't interested in music, didn't care about music. But they thought, here you have a bunch of guys, and they're going to be around for 5 years. And in that time, we need to extract literally every single last dime we can from it. And it's like, said like a true capitalist, said like a true kind of person who understands their role as a capitalist is to extract, you'll make these guys very rich and they'll probably die of drug overdoses, and that doesn't really matter. There'll be wonderful t-shirts to print about them and their obituaries to write. But you extract, and then jump.
Was a wonderful
was that the model right from the get-go?
In support of the RAF Benevolent Fund.
I mean, going back to the Beatles, that would be next. Apart from the fact you have I think the sort of patrician EMI kind of corporate types you have. There were sort of a lot of controls initially about what you could do in the studio. There was the attempt to enforce like other people's songs on and stuff. But the worst thing I think, which is still going on in about 1964, actually it ultimately results in them refusing point blank to tour anymore, was just they were worked to death. Because as you say, it was going to be a short-lived phenomenon. They want to extract every penny they could out of it. The deals were horrendous. That was one massive ingredient in Brian Epstein's suicide, I think, is that they were just exploited and ripped off in every single direction. And they were just flogged to death on these tours of American towns, like endless dates, endless promo, etc. So but going back as well, I think that the Elvis, the Baz Luhrmann Elvis movie, so for all its sort of fast and looseness in some ways, gets to a real truth. And it sort of personalises it. So it makes, to me, the character of Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis Presley's manager in that, is the sort of personification of capitalism, and Elvis becomes the personification of the sort of proletarian pop performer. And you just see in front of each the puppet master controlling the strings, pushing their product into the things that will extract the maximum capital.
My dad was immensely proud to be doing this.
I was reading a thing the other day by
honestly, I can see him standing up in front of them saying,
how
I'm
the
your
reason why, for
today.
example,
what a privilege. Thank you for your service.
We look at men in expensive, £3,000 suits, isn't it? Because they're wearing this sort of absurd outfit, but that's the language of
and a Canadian
class,
army
and
captain
this is what
who looked after his
communicated as desirable.
in front of the Lancaster,
modelled in the suit is
edges up to him and whispers in.
But what kind of happens at a certain point?
To which Dad says, "What do you mean it's not happening? The plane is sinking.
1960s maybe.
We need to
I think that
it's urgent.
All of a sudden, mass culture is suddenly identified by capital as being that's where it's at.
Why not?
And so kind of the cool is mine.
Too young.
And there was a lot of talk about mining cool when grunge came around, and sort of very quickly its authenticity is shredded, and they're all sort of kind of the look is appropriated.
And by the way, I'm
very good at that. It's very skilled in spotting the captain grunge or metal or whatever it is. And mining it.
His dad said they were
is that a theme that you've seen in the work you've done?
So, Dad,
absolutely, that relates back to that would be one definition, I would say, of the ongoing struggle in pop music constantly. The struggle is that it's daft in a way to expect capitalism to do anything else. That's what it's great at. As you say, it's part of the dynamism of capitalism, which we underestimate at our peril. It will.
I can't fly.
If it can't contain and therefore kind of repress and overlay with something else, which it tried to do to rock and roll, and tried to restore post-war balladry, but then it all broke out again with the British invasion. So.
And that's that kind of spirit of wartime improvisation, isn't it?
And so to me,
I mean, again, going back to this experience,
rather than just go, many years ago, kind of a sort of Adorno-ish way.
A lot of the originally I was doing a kind of a project on American pilots, the B-17s that flew from, and their pilots obviously were all young lads.
To me, that is actually the dynamism of popular culture as well. Is that it has to reconfigure. It has to reinvent. And that's why you get new genres invented
19, 20, 21-year-olds flying these terrifyingly dangerous missions. The Americans doing
kind of
daytime
bloated,
diamond
corporatized genre that was once exciting.
And I always found that kind of
beyond imagining
culture industry
how terrifying that would have been.
Kind of a bit,
but I think there are things you can get
kind of,
a 19-year-old to do that you can't get.
It's also tainted. You can't, only
I think
as
time goes by and you get on a bit,
possibly be viewed
your
as
appreciation
authenticity at all.
Risk and danger and mortality
is it?
Quite different.
but also,
and I think that's
only allows the upper class
appeal of having
creator
guys
and the
of
upper
that
class
age.
Audience agency. Nobody else has any agency.
What would your father perhaps have
and
made
it's
of that?
And also it totally, if you look at everything
from
a
number of observations.
Country to
one
hip-hop,
is at the beginning of the book when
working
war
class
starts,
music, right from the get-go.
He's sort of 16. He actually talks about being very excited.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just think
it's an awful lot of his friends
point I'm not sure even I was fully aware of before I started researching this book. People just don't get it.
Just
music, popular music,
join the Royal Air Force.
I find it almost working class. Not the white working class, the working class as a whole.
About the scale of participating in the conflict.
One of the things I found odd recently,
and by 1942, when
I listened to Beyonce's country album,
to contribute,
and it didn't actually sound like a country album to me at all. It sounded like nothing inherently wrong with it. It sounded like a Beyonce album.
By 42, 43,
but also there was, country music is about misery. It's about truck drives in the rain and hardship and tough lives and coal miners' daughters and all that kind of stuff.
So I think there was a high degree of motivation.
And it's like, well, if you're going to do
that's the first thing I say. The second thing I say,
you've got to do something about being poor and having a tough time, surely.
Dad was
again, it seemed like a kind of a genre, a sound that had been mined and sort of this kind of very produced, very slick sort of album and come as a result, but it doesn't really have any of the essence of country music in it.
In
daylight, I don't know, but
44 and 45
actually
was just the casualty rate was even
out of
higher.
I want to say, I think there's a lot of joy in country music as well. Sometimes there's sort of joy within the misery, which is, I suppose one could say, problematic, depending on where they locate the misery.
The second thing,
and one of the things I feel is that over the 70s, as sort of in line with Nixon's Southern strategy, I kind of feel like the cause of sort of poverty going to be celebrated as a sort of aspect of proletarian pride.
We've had it tough.
Right back at landing,
angry about or like that might be changing.
How dreadfully captured pilots were treated.
In terms of Cowboy Carter, the Beyonce album.
So I think he held them in
not a great deal of pain or misery.
The other thing is, he loved his training in Conquer City,
perhaps I think it's reasonably progressive is just almost just its ontology, just the fact that it exists and that Beyonce did it, and that she did it because she'd felt unwelcome at the Country Music Awards when she played with the Chicks, the Dixie Chicks, and she felt like, and look, she hasn't said it quite explicitly, but I think it's implied in who she's chosen to work with on the album. It's just that there is, country music isn't strictly the music of the white working class. Once again, it's always it's thoroughly intermingled and fused and derived from blues to a certain extent, from jazz. There have always been black country performers, not just Charlie Pride.
There are widespread tales, particularly at this moment after those two just purely apocryphal. There were widespread tales in 1914 of young lads from kind of Glasgow to Barnsley to London,
small town,
lining up outside recruiting centres to join the British Expeditionary Force.
I feel like this was therefore
it was going to be really exciting. I mean, it is an adventure with your mates.
I guess one thing that I've noticed recently that John Savage has got to put, I don't know if it's out yet, but it was coming out about kind of such a queer history of pop. And I think there's this sort of this kind of an overlap
not in music. Where we are in time now, historically, we have
everyone from Little Richard to George Michael,
a century of
various
terrible
other key queer,
and perhaps sort of kind of culturally. Essentially
become
sites of something really quite different.
Resistance, experimentation of identity.
We're not in. I mean, even though we have
a war in
Ukraine at the moment, Great Britain isn't in a war of national survival.
For the music industry, it's a music capital. Often finds it very difficult to know what to do with 1939,
other than obviously suppress their
queer necessarily in 1914, I don't think, but definitely in 1939.
I mean, has that come up as a theme in your writing?
There's that overlap there.
And so, potentially, one's view of the world is really something quite different.
Class. Black, which I would include as working class.
After the war, obviously, am I right in thinking your father took part in the Berlin airlift?
One or the other, and quite often all three.
He took
he did something. That's where, as you say, there's Little Richard, but
one mission very early on.
Intense channeling of queer culture, even just within rock and roll, even within jailhouse rock,
and in fact, escorted
it's always there
over German airspace by the Russian Air Force,
girl group stuff. It's there
rather uncomfortable about so soon after the end of the war.
It's front and central in glam. It's still there, very present in a lot of punk and post-punk. It's there throughout 80s pop and so on and so forth.
So it's absolutely vital. So Dad did one mission
left out
in the Berlin airlift. He actually got posted in 48 to Egypt.
And I think there was a brilliant book on the 1930s by Julia Gardner, I think it's called Intimate History, and there's a bit at the end of it which is just talking about working class life,
so to speak.
And she talks about the experience
so he didn't participate in
gay male life in working class London.
At the very early start of testing it out.
The picture that she paints is where lots of things are kind of known and tolerated. After there's a sort of a general in this still very close-knit, occupied terrace mid-1950s by kind of houses written very close together. That sort of if men were having
kind of an occupied strip in
kind of
secret
zone relations with one another.
What kinds of duties did he have
not spoken about, and there were sort of all sorts of social ways of kind of managing these sorts of things.
Concern about how the
and I guess when you get
the independence was going to proceed,
this explosion of popular culture.
This is with Israel and Palestine.
Yes, precisely.
Queer life runs through it, as you say.
A very relevant conversation today.
I think that there are moments where you go from this sort of
detachment of troops
kind of version
in
of
Israel and Palestine kind of at the time in anticipation
of repression, really,
trying to
into kind of the desire to be kind of explicit about self and identity.
Part of that,
and this is where you get some really in the first version of Tutti Frutti by Little Richard. It's really much more explicit about
there was no was not involved in sort of
being a rent boy
or anything like that. It was more a show of presence,
was the gist of it.
Focus.
And then there's the famous sort of Starman moment where
emerged,
kind
and
of
not unreasonably, there was a considerable amount of concern about how it was going to proceed.
Enables that? I mean, other than
quite a number of terrorist incidents,
artistic integrity and courage, but is there a kind of structural explanation to that ability to be explicit about oneself in ways that were
military presence, and indeed others, was there to try and keep that as measured as possible.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, as you say, that wasn't really possible.
You have this situation
in Little Richard's time.
disintegrating.
That's the kind of Bowdlerisation of
1947 is this key year where.
You know, I guess Little Richard made the subliminal about as explicit as you possibly could, right? So just in his performance in Asia.
And I would say
structurally,
in 1947,
this is a slightly liberal argument, but it's also a historical argument. I would just say the fact
we don't know what to do. We'll
there's the
hand it back to the
1967 Sexual Offences Act, which makes homosexuality at least semi-legal,
you have this,
which both reflects probably more important needs, where public attitudes towards homosexuality. So they soften somewhat. There's a sort of, there's a sort of symbolic, formal public
having a military presence in the region, saying, well, so if to both sides, there is this force here, so think carefully about what you do. Is probably a sort of kind of diplomatically and militarily
the vocabulary
actually capable of doing
sometimes
at that moment.
Explicit reference to homosexuality are therefore
a couple of decades before, and you have probably I think it was Freddie Mercury famously said, "Well, I'm not coming out to the commercial suicide," which is. I totally respect that, and it's obviously everybody's individual choice to
military
be in or out or whatever. But it does show you
production, and it really started
what his thinking was, and he was he wanted to sell records.
Participated.
And there was, he said,
part of his role in the Royal Air Force was
even though there had been those sort of legal changes, that his audience, he understood it was broadly, as far as he was concerned, heterosexual young men who would buy Queen albums and didn't want to, and he didn't want to kind of rock the boat in that way. So there's still all those kind of constraints there.
He stepped back from the Royal Air Force.
I actually think a lot of reactions to David Bowie's announcement that he was bisexual in 1972 was not positive. So in terms of like the letters that were arriving at,
in January 1973, he was taking me to my.
But in terms of the case of Freddie Mercury, it's particularly interesting because he kind of did a Little Richard in a way, in that he made it about as strongly implicit as you could possibly do from the name of the band.
He was only 49, and he
by the sort of late 70s, early 80s with the sort of clone
and remained beleaguered for much of the.
And I hate to say it, but he was probably proved right.
He was able to
when they
join the
did
National
the
Health Service
Break Free drag video,
but was really.
It tanked in America. They had an absolutely huge hit before that with Radio Gaga, which is sort of something sort of slightly fascistic, sort of seeming sort of populist anthem. Then they do something which isn't actually a million miles away stylistically. I want to break free because the drag video, it just tanks completely. It destroys their career in America, and they never really recovered in America, even after the triumph of Live Aid.
With my mother and my sister, and my mother asked
they never recovered in America. And so he kind of had
committed something to paper. We didn't know anything about it.
It's still
and I found
depressing that that so much of the history of queer music is essentially, which is misunderstood. We think these things are obvious now because of how implicit it was.
And I feel they fade away
rather wisely. But in fact, it wasn't necessarily understood except a very subliminal level.
You can imagine how thrilled we were
back in the day.
This incredible record.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also the kind of the advances in gay liberation that have been made since the 1980s,
where lots of things were happening,
and where we are now,
Israel,
which is there are some kind of
seeing General MacArthur
there is some kind of rollback at the moment, but broadly things are much better than they were 40 years ago.
He had an incredible time.
I think it's quite difficult like looking back to recognise.
Oh yes, he was
what a battlefield.
He was a kind and gentle
particularly
man,
in the 1980s. Gay rights.
He made the world a better place, and very positive. And the book is really.
I always find the 80s very interesting
technological change and how lucky he was to do it.
Acute sort of tabloid homophobia. But if you look at the kind of,
we was finishing a moment, but what I will do is place a link to the book.
Shop Boys, to Bronski Beats, to
in the episode notes for the
several other
podcasts. So if you're listening, and it sounds like the sort of thing that you'd enjoy,
a number of
a gift for a relative,
kind of
either
explicitly queer,
or, as we always say in this podcast,
clearly,
if you're buying the book,
please clearly, evidently
from a local
indicating it.
bookshop. Not one of the big
in that period.
We shall not name for legal reasons.
There's something really interesting about that moment.
Kind of.
I guess my theory is that you have,
because they've got all the money, and you need
the beginnings of liberalisation in the 60s, but you don't really see.
Mark, it's been a
real
lag
time in the 80s, kind of
and perhaps
sort of a period where
come back
the beginnings of things in the 60s
aviation again, that would be a pleasure as well.
That's actually.
I'd be thrilled to do that, Nick, and I'm extremely grateful for you devoting the time to
I suppose what.
Thanks so much. Take good care.
80s neoliberal regimes of Thatcher and Reagan hadn't cottoned on to which the sort of so-called left neoliberal regimes later of Clinton and Blair would, is that you could the co-optation of various 60s ideas, which was already underway in the 80s, hadn't got as far as social liberalism. It's got as far as sort of some notion of freedom. Let's repurpose the sort of countercultural notion of freedom as sort of competitive individualism in the marketplace. But Reagan and Thatcher remained social conservatives. And so, what I say in the book is that the 80s was equally one of the most homoerotic eras in pop, but it's also an incredibly homophobic. 80s, homophobia and homoeroticism are sort of equally 80s tropes, as it were. And so, and I try to say it neutrally, because I don't mean to point any fingers at anyone, but it's just all of the things that we think were obviously gay about the 80s weren't quite so clear at the time, and I lived through it, We didn't know, because he was evasive about it, that Neil Tennant of the Pet Shop Boys was gay. George Michael was certainly not out, and Elton John married a woman. We didn't know that Elton John was gay. Morrissey was rather vague. Boy George was rather vague and denied being gay. Even that seems incomprehensible now. But so there was really only, I think, Mark Ullman was fairly explicit, and I think that and Bronski Beat were, as you say. So yeah.
We must draw to a close in a moment, but I was thinking there's so much to talk about here, and we haven't even really looked at particularly black music, which it would be really interesting to talk about again in the future if you'd like to. Well, fantastic. Well, what I'd like to do, Toby, is perhaps in a little while invite you back on the podcast to talk further about some of these issues, because. I do a little bit about popular music in this podcast, but not a lot. So it'd be great to continue the chat if you'd be up for that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Fab. Okay, let's get onto the plug. So available in all good bookshops at the moment, is that right?
Bookshops on Amazon, direct from Repeater, from Houseman's, wherever you like. Mixing Pop and Politics, A Marxist History of Popular Music, published by Repeater, out now.
Brilliant. And as we always say at the end of the podcast, if you can, please get the book from an independent retailer. The big guys have got more than enough money, so make sure the little guys get as much help from you as you can. I'll put a link to the book in the podcast show notes. But for now, Toby, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. It's been fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to talking further. So let's catch up next time. And all the very best.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Take care.
You bet.